Good morning, friends. One of the questions that always comes up when we talk about God's sovereignty, and rightly so, is concerning the interplay between the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man, or man's free will. In other words, if God is sovereign, such that he ordains all things that come to pass, then how can man be responsible for his own actions? If God is sovereign in complete control as we've claimed he is, then are we not all just robots doing what God programmed us to do? Do we actually have any ability to choose at all if this is true? And if we don't have the ability to choose, or to state it even more plainly, if we don't have free will, then how can we be held accountable? How can we be considered responsible for what we do? If God is sovereign such that he makes us a certain way and makes us do things that are sinful, then how can he punish us for that? Well, the simple truth is that while God is sovereign and he does ordain all that comes to pass, he is not the author of evil. He does not make us do sinful, evil things. And there are a couple of layers to this that I need to unpack, and this devotion might be a little bit longer than usual today, because two things. First, we need to understand what free will actually is and how it works and the inherent limitations of it. And secondly, we need to understand how God's sovereignty operates in the world at the same time as man's free will. So first, this thing called free will. The problem that we have with free will, like other situations, isn't actually a problem with the thing itself, with the free will itself. It's a more of a problem with the way we think about it, the way we define it in our own minds, because if we have a wrong definition of what free will is, then we're going to be very confused and we're not going to be able to sort ourselves through this. So the problem is that people think of the term free will and they don't understand often enough that despite the word free being in there are limitations to free will. According to the very nature of free will, there are limitations. So the word free being in there can be misleading, okay? If you've been listening to these devotions for a while, this likely won't be new to you, but hopefully a good recap, because God is sovereign, but yes, we do have free will. We all do have our own wills, which means we are able to choose in any given circumstance to pursue that which we desire most. That's what free will is. Okay, and that's where we're going to find the inherent limitation. Free will is not defined as the perfect ability to do whatever. That's not what free will is. Free will is the ability to choose, okay, and then pursue something according to your greatest desire. Let me say that again. The free will is the ability to choose and pursue something according to your greatest desire. And that's where the natural constraints come in. Because according to my own will, according to my own desire, I might wish to fly without the aid of an airplane or any other equipment. Now, I can pursue that goal. I have that ability. I have the free will to do that. But will I ever accomplish it, no matter how fast I flap my arms? Of course not. But the simple fact that there are laws of physics which prohibit me from flying unaided does not mean that my free will doesn't exist. I am still able to choose and pursue whatever my desire is. The other aspect of this is the will's connection with desire itself. Because when we consider the idea of free will, we are talking about the concept of free choice. Okay, free choice. Again, I am able to choose to do, or at least to attempt to do, what I desire. And we will always choose according to our greatest desire. And that is crucial for us to understand. That is a crucial and fundamental limitation or constraint on this idea of free will, because you cannot disconnect our will from our desire, because it is our underlying desires that then drive our will. So we can't get away from that, because no matter what situation you might think about, no matter what scenario you posit as an example, you will always choose according to your greatest desire. For instance, not long ago, I talked with a young man who, before his conversion to Christ, was involved in certain criminal activities. And we were talking about this idea of free will, and he was struggling with it. which is okay. It's a difficult concept for many of us. But my point is, he was trying to tell me that we do not actually always choose according to our greatest desire, that we can go against our will in that way. And so the example he used was times when prior to his conversion, when he really wanted to engage in a certain criminal activity because of the earthly benefit, pleasure, and satisfaction he thought it would bring to him, but he didn't. But he didn't go through with doing it because he didn't want to take the chance of going to jail. And he used that as an example of how he actually didn't do what he wanted, that he actually chose against his desire, which would then undercut what I was trying to say, that our free will is always determined by our desire. But here's the thing. The truth of the matter of his own situation, which he admitted to without even realizing it, is that even though he desired to do that bit of criminal activity, his greater desire was to not get caught and not go to jail. So he did, in fact, choose according to his greatest desire. He wanted to not go to jail more than he wanted to get the supposed benefits of the criminal activity. And there is no circumstance we can conjure up where this isn't true. Our wills are completely and always bound to our desires. We will always choose to do what we desire most in any given situation. Now, why is this important? Well, because we do have free will, even in acknowledging that God's sovereignty exists as well. And part of how that can be is because free will does have those constraints on them, as we have seen. Because the thing that happens is people think that, well, God's sovereignty means he's in absolute control, but if my free will means I'm in absolute control, at least of my life, and those two things can't go together. If I'm in absolute control of my life because I have free will, then there must be something that God is not in absolute control of, which means he can't actually be sovereign. So these two things can't be true at the same time. This is where we come to the conclusion that God can't be completely sovereign if man has free will. And the converse, what people end up thinking, is that if God is sovereign, then man can't have free will and we're all robots. But it's just not true. God can be sovereign and man can have free will, because man's free will does not equate to complete control, does not equate to complete and total autonomy, self-determination, absolute control. Because even when it comes to us having free will, there are those inherent constraints upon our free will itself. So, because to recap what those are, having the will to do something doesn't mean it's physically possible for you to do it. or there might be other forces outside of yourself that will stop you, that will keep you from accomplishing what your will would desire. I might have the desire and the will, therefore the will, to be a professional basketball player. But my physical lack of hand-eye coordination, my lack of natural ability, that many people are born with, but I was not, that those facts combined with the incredible natural skill that so many other people do have, the competitors have, means I'm just not going to be a professional basketball player. So our will, free though it may be in the sense of choosing and desiring whatever, and going after whatever we desire, is still bound by external forces that prevent us from attaining what we desire sometimes. And secondly, our will is bound by internal things like those desires. For we will not will to do something if we have a greater desire to do something else. So, with all of that here, let me move on rapidly. Otherwise, this devotion will be feature movie length, which is not its purpose. But how does all this relate to the sovereignty of God? Well, actually, let me take a step back for a second, even though this will add more length to it. But a quick side note, God has free will as well. Now, there's some areas where God's will is like ours, and one big area where it's not. The area that God's free will is not like ours is because I mentioned a moment ago that for us, there are things outside of ourselves that can stop us from accomplishing our will, okay, what we desire. But there is nothing external to God that can stop him from doing what he desires. We read about that yesterday. No one can thwart his plans. No one can stay his hand, can resist him and cause him to not do what he wishes to do. Okay. But it is true that just like us, God's free will is also bound by his desires, by his underlying nature. Therefore, we are told in scriptures that God cannot lie. Yes, that word cannot is in there. God has a free will, but he will never choose to lie. In fact, he cannot choose to lie because according to his nature, he will never desire to lie. Okay, and so his will is bound by who he is, by what he desires. Okay, so once again, we have a demonstration that free will does not mean I can do anything. Free will has the inherent limitations of our natures and our desires. Just further food for thought. Now, specifically to God's sovereignty. The best way I can explain God's sovereignty in relation to man's ability to choose, man's free will, okay, is this way. God ordains all things that come to pass. But what does that mean? Because there's a difference between the idea that God says, I ordain all things that come to pass in that this is what will happen, versus God saying, I am going to personally make them do this. Let me give you an example to try to flesh this out. We're told in Romans 9 that God raised Pharaoh up so that he could show his power in delivering the people of Israel out of his grasp. This is going way back to the Exodus, where the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh of the time, had enslaved the Hebrew people, using them for labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Moses, let my people go, all that stuff. Okay. So God says, Paul tells us in Romans 9 that God raised Pharaoh up for the purpose of showing his power in delivering the people of Israel out of his grasp. Does this mean that God used Pharaoh like a puppet on a string, personally controlling every action, God himself directly causing Pharaoh to make sinful, wicked choices? When we say that God ordained that Pharaoh be there for God's own uses, is that what we mean? That God possessed Pharaoh and directly caused him to sin and do all these horrible things? No. Pharaoh was a sinful human being. He didn't need anyone's help to make sinful, wicked choices. He made them of his own desire, of his own will. He put the Hebrew male babies to death at one point out of his own desire to keep the nation of Israel from becoming too strong of a people and rivaling him. He enslaved them in the first place because, while reprehensible, slave labor is useful to an ambitious tyrant. He chased after them with his army, cornering them along the Red Sea, where God ended up wiping that army out because he couldn't let his prestige amongst the nations take a hit in letting his captives go free. And yet it is true that God ordained all these things to come to pass. He has said, in my paraphrase, this is how Pharaoh is going to be. While at the same time, God did not author, God was not the source of any of the evil that Pharaoh did. Pharaoh did it because Pharaoh wanted to do it. And so we find ourselves in a place similar to when we talk about the triune nature of God and many other things. There are some things that are very hard for us to understand how they fit together. But the baseline thing is that things can be mysterious. Things can be difficult for us to understand, and yet we can be confident that they are not self-contradictory. Because if they were contradictory, we could legitimately refuse to believe them. We could know that these things simply cannot be true because God is not a contradictory God. He will not contradict himself. But There are some things about God and about the way God operates in this world that are just simply hard for us to understand, that are mysterious in the extreme, because our finite, fallible human brains just can't suss out how it all fits together. But that doesn't mean it's not true, because God is so much greater than we are. Okay? His perception and his wisdom and his intellect and all those things are just so much greater than what we are able to comprehend. But this is the truth that we have from God's word, what he has revealed to us about himself, that he is sovereign over all things and that he ordains all things that come to pass. He says this is how it will be. And he does so in an active sense, not just in a reacting to the situation sense. But at the same time, he does not make anyone sin. We sin because of our own free will, because of the desires that we have that compel our freedom of will to do those things. This is how we can be morally responsible for the sin we commit. God does not force us to sin. He can turn our evil to good, in fact, because he is sovereign, and his plan for salvation and glory and goodness for himself and his people will be accomplished despite our sin, and actually because God uses our sin and turns evil to good in his sovereign power. So he can use even our sin for good, but even as he does so, that does not mean he's the one causing us to sin. We do that ourselves according to our own free will. Now, as we begin to wrap this up here, this is a deep topic, and I'm sure it brings up even more questions, which I hope to get to and consider in depth in time. And I don't often do this, maybe once or twice before, but if you've made it this far in the devotion, particularly on this topic, and you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I may be able to answer them in a reply then and there, or perhaps I'll use them for the basis of a future devotion, because it takes a while to work through some of these things. But the most important thing to leave today with is this: God is in control. He presides over all things. He is sovereign. Which means, in some sense, yes, God even uses our sinfulness to accomplish his goals. And he created the world with the purpose, in the knowledge that we would sin, and with the purpose of using our sin to accomplish his goals. But our sinfulness is just that, ours. He didn't give it to us. He doesn't make us sin. We do that all on our own. But yes, in his sovereignty, God will even turn that to his good purpose. I love you guys. I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.